Hi, I'm Tiffany, and today during this module, we're going to be reviewing interpretation training for RYSA 2020. We will review what is interpretation, what is the role of an interpreter, what are some best practices for interpretation, and important norms that we should be abiding for good communication. So what is interpretation? Interpretation is facilitating spoken communication between two parties who speak different languages, as opposed to translation, which is focused on changing one written document from one language to another. Here at RYSA, we will mostly work on interpreting. And the mode of interpreting that we will be focusing on is consecutive, meaning that interpreting begins after a speaker has begun and finished speaking to understand an entire message. For example, if you are interpreting for a student and a teacher, what you may do is have the student speak first, have them pause, and interpret that first message. Then you will allow the student or teacher to interpret the next part, and then you will interpret. This is what it means to do consecutive interpreting, which is the mode that we want to strive for at RYSA to ensure accuracy. The role of the interpreter. The role of an interpreter should be a language facilitator, they should also be a clarifier, and they should also be a cultural broker, meaning they should facilitate conversation as if there wasn't a difference in languages. They should clarify messages to make sure that both parties are being understood. And as always, they should act as a cultural broker in case there are cultural misunderstandings that arise throughout the conversation. Best practices for interpretation. We will review confidentiality, accuracy, impartiality, professionalism, and intercultural communication. Confidentiality. Please do not disclose private information shared. What is shared during a conversation should stay in that conversation. The only time it should leave if there is some concern of safety, but really, this should be a confidential conversation that should also be expressed during the introductions when you first begin interpreting. And make sure you protect any written client information. Discard of any notes properly and do not have those laying around. Accuracy. It's important to interpret all messages completely without omissions or additions. Also, you should not be substituting any messages. Make sure to correct any interpreting errors and be honest about mistakes. It's okay to make a mistake, but we need to make sure we clarify it as soon as possible. And make sure you ask clarifying questions, because these could help make sure that we are interpreting the correct messages. But as always, make sure that you also interpret these questions so everyone can fully participate in the conversation. Impartiality. Personal opinions or values should not influence objectivity of interpretation. Our thoughts and opinions should not have any value into what is being shared in the conversation. We should advise immediately if there are conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest, meaning we should not be interpreting for close family friends or any other conflict of interest areas like that. When asked to interpret, do not let your other role at RYSA affect interpreting, meaning we want to focus our role as an interpreter and making sure we can communicate messages from both parties accurately. Professionalism. Be honest about your abilities. It's okay to say that maybe you don't feel comfortable about interpreting for a specific circumstance, but please be honest and share that immediately. Show respect for all staff, families, and students. Make sure that throughout you continue to follow RYSA staff manual and protocols. Know your role and respect role boundaries, meaning it's easy for sometimes families to feel very comfortable with an interpreter. And on the one hand, that's great because we do want them to be able to share what their message and if they need any help. However, we should not be encouraging unprofessional boundaries, meaning we should not be speaking to students or families outside of allotted times or outside of allotted meetings. Intercultural communication. Let staff know if there are any significant cultural misunderstandings. This is really important because this could change the conversation and could change what the meaning of a party's message. So it's important to be aware of this and to bring them up at an appropriate time. And make sure that you use appropriate and professional ways of showing respect. Norms for good interpretation. We will review how to do professional introductions and the importance of using first person or direct speech, how to manage the flow of communication, and while still having this cultural context lens in mind, and positioning and knowing your environment in this remote context. Professional introductions. Introduce yourself and your role at RYSA. You should do this at the beginning of every conversation that you will be interpreting. Make sure that you explain that you will be interpreting everything and that you will be interpreting with interjections, meaning that you will ask for pauses and clarifications so that you can ensure an accurate and impartial interpretation. Make sure you're also using first-person speech. This increases accuracy and allows for, again, the full message of a party to be received. I know it may sometimes be a little bit awkward to use first person, but we really want to encourage this because this is the best way to practice good communication and good interpretation. Managing the flow of communication. It's okay to pause a conversation when your memory is full and may need a break to be able to catch up and accurately interpret everything that has been said. You may also pause a conversation when there are too many voices speaking at once. It's okay to ask for a pause and ask for a clarification and even a repetition of something. Also make sure to pause conversation when there may be a cultural misunderstanding. As I said previously, it's important to make sure that we are aware of these so we don't alter the messages of the parties. And again, always ask questions if there's a need to clarify, both to the family and to the staff member that may need interpretation. Positioning an environment. This is very important and even more particulars maybe in the context that we're doing RYSA this summer remotely. It's important to think about our physical space and think about where we are in our homes, and if one as an interpreter, it's a appropriate positioning, and also if the family is positioned in a confidential or a space where they can freely speak. You also want to ask yourself, can I hear the speaker? Can they hear me? Are there any distractions on my end or on one of the other parties' ends? And again, is this the best confidential space? I recognize that this may be difficult because we and families alike may be living with others or may be in remote contexts that don't allow for the most private of spaces, but please be aware of these differences so that we can still have good interpretation and share good communication. And very similarly, if you don't do video call interpretation, you may be doing phone interpretation. And this will require similar norms. We want to ensure a quiet space free of distractions for all parties involved. We want to make sure that we still introduce ourselves professionally and explain how the interpretation will work. We want to make sure that we also speak loud and clear. And as always, we will ask for pauses and clarifications. Now that we have reviewed all of these steps and protocols for having good interpretation and good communication, please look at the description below to click for the link to the quiz that will be a short quiz for a check for understanding. Thank you.